Hi, we continue in Luke 8 today and complete the chapter. And we're completing the section that is this sandwich between the healing and the raising, really, of the daughter of Jairus, the synagogue leader, and the healing and salvation of the bleeding woman in the middle of the story. So we left off right where the bleeding woman had been healed and came out of her hiding, and Jesus declared that her faith had saved her. And then we begin in verse 49, as you see, while he was still speaking, someone came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Do not trouble the teacher any longer." And so, as we've been doing, you can see on the right side of the screen, the blue part is the Mark version that Luke is taking from, and then his section, Luke's section, is in the pink in the middle, and Matthew on the right. And as we've been seeing, Luke continues much of Mark. That's the part that's not in bold in Luke, but changes a lot. He leaves out all the part that's in bold in Mark, and he adds all the part that's bold in Luke. And he shortens it substantially, and much of the shortening we can see is in our section that we're looking at now, which is this whole section. And you see how much of Mark's section that Luke has left out. Mark's is very grim. Luke's is grim enough, but Mark's is even more grim, and we'll look at those details as we go. We've been looking also at keywords, and the keywords we saw in the previous section were touch, and here we're seeing the connection between the two daughters, and that's the key that we've been seeing all along, and also the issue of salvation. And so those are the elements that will connect this. And there's also another little element that'll perhaps be a surprising one that'll connect even more deeply than that. So while he was still speaking, someone came, which is to say it's a rude interruption, and it must be coming from the pathos of that they waited for someone to come. The synagogue leader went out to see if he could find Jesus, or we don't know if he was trying to find just anybody and happened to find Jesus. We don't know anything about that. But along they came back to the house, and delayed by the bleeding woman's intervention there with Jesus by touching the fringe of his cloak. And now it seems to be too late. And so perhaps that person is coming to say, if you'd only hurried, or why did Jesus get in the way, or those doggone people in the crowd who delay, whatever their thoughts might be, it seems like it's too late. Your daughter is dead. Do not trouble the teacher anymore. And the word for trouble here is skule, which is taken from Mark. But in Luke, it echoes Luke 7:6, the centurion. Let's go back to that for 1 second here, where the centurion said, "Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I'm not worried to have you come under my roof." So there the issue was the honor-shame issue that although the centurion was apparently the patron of the synagogue, the people say that he built the synagogue, obviously not literally, but through his financial support is the implication. But he sees himself as not worthy to have Jesus come under his roof, and he uses the same word, to not trouble him, to trouble Jesus. But here, the trouble is based on the idea that there's no point anymore, that his ability to do anything must be ended, and so don't bother him. Is this concern for Jesus' time? Is it a matter that these people are concerned that the one they call teacher, not Lord, or not even master, as Peter called him in the verses before, has too busy and shouldn't be bothered, or is there something else going on here? Maybe there's a little bit of sarcasm in their voice here, if he had been here, it would have worked, but now it's his fault that it's too late. But we can't know any of that for sure. All those are possibilities in this scene full of pathos. They call him teacher, and as we've seen, teacher is the word for Jesus a lot of times. It's mostly used by people who are his opponents. It's a lower status title, obviously, than Lord would be, and certainly of Son of God. But it's not completely faithless. We'll see in 9:38, someone who calls Jesus teacher does have a faith for healing. But most of the time it is that case. And certainly here, they have no faith that Jesus can do anything. When Jesus heard this, different from different from Mark's overhearing what they said, or as Ched Myers has suggested and others have also followed, perhaps that could be translated ignoring the word that they said, not listening to the idea that they were dead. But Luke doesn't have that ambiguity. He just says, when Jesus heard this, he replied, "Do not fear." Mark's had "do not fear, only believe," and that's true here too, and she will be saved. But we don't have the "she will be saved" in Mark. And in Mark, he allowed no one to follow except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and they come to the house, whereas in Luke, as we'll see, it's only when they enter into the house that we find that those people are even there. So do not fear. It's the most common commandment in the Bible. Do not be afraid. Only believe. And the form of it here, it's second person singular, so it's addressed to one person. Whether that's to the messenger or to Jairus isn't clear. But it's only to one. So whose faith is at issue? Certainly it must be Jairus, and that's what people suggest. And from Stegman and DeToit's piece, which I showed at the beginning of this unit, they suggest that Jesus is calling him to start believing, which puts him also in parallel with the centurion in an ironic way. Jesus said there, not in Israel have I seen such faith, and that leads most people to believe that the centurion had faith, but if you go back and watch my video from that section, it's much more ambiguous than that. Perhaps there's a sarcastic element that this patron, this Roman patron of the synagogue, is the one that the local Jews are relying on and speaking on behalf of. But there are also other parallels with that story, as we'll see before we're done here today. So only trust and she will be saved, again, focusing on the issue not just of healing, but saving. So when he came to the house, although the word is ice here, into. So when they came into the house, there's no sense of coming to it and then entering it separately. When he entered into the house, he would not allow anyone to enter except Peter, John, and James, and the child's father and mother. A couple things going on here. As I've been noting in this section, ever since the disciples got into the boat to cross the lake over to the Jairus side, we did not see them get out there, and we did not see them get out when they came back to the Capernaum or otherwise Jewish side of the lake. We only saw Peter with Jesus in the crowd, wondering about how he could try to determine who touched him, given the crowd pressing in on them. But now we find that Peter, John, and James are there. This is the first time we hear any hint in Luke there's going to be this inner trio that are special. We'll see them again, though, in the Transfiguration, and then also down in chapter 22. We don't know that much about them, though, and here they are. The child's father and mother is now part of a three-level transformation of the leader. We saw at the beginning of our passage that Luke had taken Mark's term arche-synagogus, a relatively rare term and a complex term, and changed it at the beginning to simply say archon, the leader of the synagogue, perhaps to make it more familiar to an audience that wouldn't understand Jewish cultural context. But here in verse 49, it is arche-synagogo, so he uses that there. But now it's child's father and mother. And I would note that that's similar to the story in John 4 of the royal official, the basileia, whose son is at the point of death, who goes and bring a royal official to a father before the story's over. For his role as leader is not very helpful when his daughter is at the point of death or here already dead. He's simply a father who is suffering. So as they enter in with the father and the mother, and we assume there are others already there, that's who we see in verse 52. They're all weeping and wailing. So as they enter into this scene, they see the weeping and wailing. Again, Luke diminishes the description from Mark's version where there's a commotion and wailing loudly, and it's emphasized there that there's this large mourning there, which is traditional mourning. Nothing unusual about that, but it's certainly the activity of people who are dealing with death. So they're all weeping and mourning here. We assume it's the disciples along with it, or is it just those who they encountered in there? We don't know. Of course, they have no direct relationship with this daughter, so there's no reason to think they would be weeping directly. But he says in the midst of the weeping and wailing, do not weep. And that's an echo of the Sermon on the Plain. Those who weep now will be consoled, and those who are consoled now will weep later. And we see other weeping in Luke's Gospel later, largely when we get to Jesus' Passion story. And he says, for she is not dead, using a verb form here, to be dead, but sleeping. Katheudo here, and we'll see that again when the disciples are sleeping at the Last Supper. I notice a similar thing, all using different language, about Lazarus in John 11, that they assumed he was dead, but that Jesus says he's asleep. But there he's saying sleeping as a metaphor for death, using a different word than we have here. So Jesus saying she's sleeping and not dead suggests that this is not actually a resurrection story, that he's not raising her from the dead, but raising her from something short of death that those people had not perceived. And the response is to laugh mockingly at him, using a rare word here, katagelon here, only here in its parallels in the New Testament. It's in the Septuagint, but all late texts. And I want to pause to note the poignancy and difficulty of this moment. One moment they're weeping and wailing over a seemingly dead girl, 12-year-old girl, and the next moment they're mocking Jesus. It's really something to see how quickly they turn to make fun of him. They could just simply ignore him, or they could express some hope in him, but they don't. And it says, knowing that she was dead. So what we're seeing is Jesus' knowledge against their knowledge. Um, that goes to the question that we've been looking at throughout this whole section since they crossed the lake, and the disciples asked, "Who is this that the wind and the waves obey him?" And again, we're going to see in the following scenes Herod asking, "Who is this?" and Jesus asking the disciples who he is. So that's one of our themes throughout this, all the way through 950 on the eve of the journey to Jerusalem, in 951, all the way through chapter 19. So they know that she's dead and laugh at Jesus, and Jesus knows that she's not dead but sleeping. And he takes her by the hand, and here's the touch issue that connects it with the previous scene. There isn't the word touch, but obviously there is the touch. He took her by the hand. And whether it's the taking her by the hand or the words that lead her spirit to return, we can't separate those out here. But he goes to the trouble of taking her by the hand and doesn't call her daughter, but child, pais, which is yet another connection with the centurion, because it was the centurion's pais, often translated as son, but it could also be servant. Here it plainly is the child. There's a father and mother, but there it was more ambiguous. And so he says to her, get up or rise, igero. It's the verb for resurrection we see in chapter 24. It'll be used for resurrection, but it's also used a number of times, as we've seen already, and it will be a number of times elsewhere. So it can be simply get up, but in the context of a story that's turning on resurrection, we have to at least think of it partially that way, even though it said she's not dead, but Jesus said she's not dead, but only sleeping. And Luke shifts Mark's language here a little bit. He leaves out the Talitha Kum, the Aramaic version of it, probably to not alienate his audience, which wouldn't know that, and maybe Mark was including it to include his Jewish audience who would recognize some of the Aramaic there. In Mark, as we see, we hear immediately the girl got up and began to walk about, and then we find out she was 12 years old. Luke switches it to her spirit returned, and he adds this phrase, and that's a very Lucan one. Lucan is certainly the gospel, and Acts is the words of the Spirit. We have the Spirit already in the very beginning with people before Jesus was born, and we'll see the Spirit at Pentecost in Acts 2 and throughout. So her spirit returned to her, went back to her. My note below suggests that one can read this as a symbolic story, as an allegorical story. If Jairus' daughter is a symbol of Israel's near-death situation in the face of Roman oppression, the healing could suggest Israel's spirit can return if the social equality that Jesus is establishing here between the bleeding woman and the daughter of privilege is restored. We can read it at that level. We can also read it at the immediate level. These stories are not limited to being heard at one level. And she got up at once, using Luke's favorite word for that, parakrima, which he uses a whole series of times, and we've seen it already. And then Jesus continuing in command mode, which you've seen since he was in Gerasa, commanding the legion in military mode. It's not military mode here, but it's still in command mode. He ordered them, or directed, as the New RSV has, to give her something to eat. And we see that he uses that a few times, and we'll see it in 17 around another healing. And something to eat here, and we'll see that in connection with 9:13. I'll show it to you right now. He said to them, you give them something to eat, which is the crowd in the wilderness. So there it's perhaps anticipating the question of who provides food for people who are hungry. Just pause to look at how a couple of artists have imagined this scene here. This one from the 10th century, from an anonymous author from Codex Egberti. And I like this one because although perhaps the images of her in some kind of reclining chair, to me it looks like Jesus is taking her out of the womb, like she's being born again, fresh here. I don't know if that was the intention or not, but that's what it appeared to me. Here's a more recent one from Greg Olson, and I provided the website link to his, so if you're interested in his art. I thought a more modern version of it was nice as well. So 2 images to convey the pathos of this scene. And we get to our last verse here, in comparison with Mark 5:43. This is all done in the privacy of the home here, and her parents were astounded. So they went from being father and mother, now being restored to being a unit. Luke adds this, so it's a very specific thing that Luke has had, and we see down below in my note that final transformation from Jairus to father and mother to parents. But the word for astounded adds another little twist at the end of our story. We hear it in the context of resurrection. Some women amongst us have astounded us, but we saw it in 2:47. Let's go back there and we'll see a surprising thing. All who heard him, which is, say, Jesus speaking with the rabbis in the temple, were amazed at his understanding, at his answers. The word for amazed here is not the word we've seen for amazed. It's existanto that we see here for astonished. And the word literally means to stand out of being, to be out of being, ex-estasin, to be out of being, or to be in ecstasy. So it can be astounded in the sense of something amazing has happened, but amazing, as we've seen earlier, is used almost always for people who don't get what's happening. But astounded perhaps is different, suggesting they're ecstatic in the religious sense, that something they've experienced has lifted them out of themselves to experience God at work. But they don't say anything about God, and neither does Jesus. In fact, he does something else. Continuing in this mode, he orders them to tell no one what had happened. And we see that echoes exactly 5:14. We'll go back to that. This is the healing of the leper, and he ordered them to tell no one. This is often understood as the messianic secret, something that originates in Mark, that he just doesn't want people to know. But I want to suggest here that it isn't so much that he doesn't want people to know. He doesn't want bad rumors coming around from people who don't understand what's happening. The people in the room are mocking Jesus, and the parents may be astounded, but he wants to control the message, and we'll see that very soon, because in the very next verse, he will call the 12 together and give them very strict instructions on what to do as they go out. So as we see this at the end here, we see the 12-year-old daughter is also connected to the 12-year-old Jesus, that both lead people to be astounded. But in addition to that, we see that the two women are made equal, and that this section really is advancing the question of who is this Jesus. Whereas the centurion in the beginning of chapter 7 seemingly had some kind of faith, or at least more faith than Jesus found anywhere in Israel, this leader has no faith that's described. And we don't know if the girl had any faith. We have no reason to think so. None is named. So it's not a matter of faith saving her. It's simply that Jesus reaches out and does this act. What a contrast with the bleeding woman who on her own goes up to Jesus, and Jesus did nothing except experience the power going out from him. So Luke has no simple formula for how healing happens, but it does have to do with this touch. So the touch of Jesus has healed two women. They're both daughters. They're both made equal. The daughter of privilege can now go on to live her life, and the daughter who had been made poor by the physicians who didn't help her can now be restored. And that's the situation that sets up for Jesus now to decide the disciples have seen enough. It's time for them to take a turn. And we'll see where that leads us in the next story. See you then. Bye-bye.